Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Mike on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Today, I conduct a conversation with an American conductor who has conducted all across the world, but is much better known for being a composer. He's one of the most performed composers writing today, and his music has been at the forefront of contemporary music since the late 1970s. It is a very great pleasure to welcome John Adams. John, it's an honour and a pleasure to meet you, to see you, and to speak with you today. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm over jet lag, so
yeah,
ready to go.
You've been working in Finland, and now I speak to you, you're in Holland, in Rotterdam. Is that right?
That's right.
And were you conducting in Finland, or had you gone to see?
Yes, I was conducting a full orchestra for the first time since March of last year. The last concert I did before the pandemic was at the Conductor.
Yeah.
And then I got home and everything shut down. And so last week I was with this marvelous orchestra in Lahti. Were very famous for their Sibelius recordings and also for their wonderful hall. Really one of the best halls in Europe. I was told that it was built by the same architects who did the Birmingham Hall.
Okay.
It's a somewhat smaller version of it.
So over Europe, and maybe Russell Johnson was involved with the acoustics, but yeah, their legacy is Dallas and Lucerne and Birmingham, and wonderful halls. John, with everyone, I always go back to the beginning and ask how music first came into your life. I've read that you had musical parents. Your mother sang and your father played the clarinet. Was music something that was always going to happen when you look back, whether that be professionally or just as part of your life?
I think that was the case. My parents, they suffered very much during the Depression, and neither of them were able to graduate from college, but they both had enormous respect for the arts. And when you have a child who shows interest in something, whether it's mathematics or science or sports or music, you're excited about that and want to encourage it. And I'm very grateful that my parents did.
And I'm sure I heard or read somewhere that you played the clarinet was your instrument, and you played in orchestras, but also in marching bands. Was that with your father as well? Did you ever share the platform with him?
Oh, yes. Well, he was my first teacher. I wanted to study violin. Our public school offered lessons, which is such an amazing thing. That would never happen these days. But there was an itinerant music teacher that came around to our very small school in New Hampshire, and he could teach everything. And I wanted to take violin, but they wouldn't let me because I was too young. And so I reluctantly settled for clarinet lessons with my father, who was actually a very wonderful teacher. He was very patient. And so when I got a little bit older, we both started playing with a band. It was a concert band in the town, Concord, New Hampshire, which is the state capital, but still not a very large city. And this was a concert band that went all the way back to the American Civil War.
Oh, wow.
And we did one rehearsal every Monday night during the summer, and then they would drag a portable band shell around to the different parks within the city, and would play Poet and Peasant Overture, or of course Sousa marches. I remember the Oberon Overture, the very difficult violin parts just being transposed up a step for the clarinet, and of course we also marched in parades on Independence Day and Labor Day.
I always ask when people have these experiences in youth, in a youth orchestra, or in your case, in a concert band, Did the conductor that was conducting you then have any sort of influence, or were you just sitting there doing your job? Did you look up and think, I wonder what that's like. I wonder why they do that. I wonder why they say that. And I wonder whether I'd like a go at it. Or was it just something that passed you by? Like other conductors, for me, for years, I never thought about what the conductor did.
I think I was aware of the act of conducting a group from a very early age. I watched some amateur musicals that my mother sang in, and I probably saw, certainly I saw Fantasia with Stokowski. I don't know exactly when I became really intensely aware of it, but certainly, by the time I was, let's say, 7 or 8 years old, I remember that I used my mother's knitting needle to conduct the stereo. And that was a way of internalizing a lot of really great music.
Yeah.
I recently heard that Gustavo Dudamel, when he was a little kid, he used toy soldiers and made an orchestra. And conducted the little people.
Yeah.
And probably that's why today he can do all the Mahler symphonies and write Spring from Memory, because once you internalize those things at a very early age, they stay with you forever.
That's right. It's too true. I didn't know that about Gustavo Dudamel. You then, as a teenager, I believe, using the ever so trustful Wikipedia, it says that's when you started composing. And you end up at Harvard. Now that there's listed at least 4 or 5 different composition teachers at Harvard, were you ever taught conducting? Because whilst you were there, you conducted the Bach Society Orchestra at Harvard for 18 months. So were you ever offered lessons, and did you take any?
I took, I would say, informal lessons for one summer.
Yeah.
There was a music festival at Dartmouth College, which is a little further north in New Hampshire from where I lived. And the music director there had studied with both Boulanger and Igor Markevich in Europe. So, we had real old school chops. And I remember being very impudent. I just went up to him and said, I want to take conducting lessons from you. And I think he was taken aback. And then he watched me. I think I was about 17 at the time, but I got a group of my fellow orchestra players who were all teenagers together, and I conducted a fairly difficult piece that had mixed meters, and he saw me, and so he must have been impressed to some point. So he gave me some basic lessons. Those are the only lessons I ever took in my life. But, so much of conducting really is just learning by doing. Or what we say, the school of hard knocks. You make mistakes, you learn eventually that the only thing the players really need is the upbeat. They don't need the downbeat, they need the upbeat. And of course, I've had the greatest conductors in the world do my music, so I've been able to watch them while they've been working.
Well, you've taken 2 of my mantras there, really. I much like you, I sat and played for the greatest conductors in the world for 22 years and watched them, and this stuff rubs off on you. And the other thing, the upbeat is all important. I remember being conducted by Gennady Rozhesvensky, the great Russian conductor, Soviet conductor, and he often would give an upbeat and never give the downbeat, and that's all you ever needed. And it took me a while to look at this and think, why aren't you giving us the downbeat? And then I realized, hey, if it's that clear, I don't need to know I now already know where the downbeat is. It's so true. It's absolutely true. What did you conduct with the Bach Society Orchestra for during those 18 months at Harvard? Was it everything and anything, or I mean, it sounds like it would have been Bach, but what was your remit?
In fact, I was severely scolded by a critic in the Harvard Crimson, which is a college newspaper, for pushing the envelope of the identity of the orchestra, because I remember one of my concerts included the Adagio from the Mahler Fifth and Afternoon of a Faun. These are pieces I always loved and wanted to do. But I remember my very first concert. I still remember the program, that it opened with a Danse Concertante by Stravinsky. We did a Mozart piano concerto. I did Création du Monde by Mio, and then ended with the Haydn 99th Symphony. And, the thing with those, particularly those late Haydn symphonies, they so rarely show up on orchestra programs because, they take 35 minutes. So they kind of take the main part of the program. And of course, most conductors don't really, they do lip service to Haydn, but they really want to do Brahms and Mahler. But they're such wonderful symphonies. And I did other Haydn symphonies in the course of my career. I remember doing a Brahms concert when I did on the Transmigration of Souls, and I preceded it with the Haydn Trauer Symphony. And I also do the La Poule, which is very unfortunately subtitled, because it's actually a very powerful minor key Sturm und Drang symphony. But anyway, I did Mozart and Beethoven's Second. It was a college chamber orchestra, so you couldn't go too far afield with the size of it.
You're right, though. Most conductors do, as you say, pay lip service, and you might see a Haydn symphony as a sort of a long overture with maybe a short concerto, but rarely do you ever see them in the second half, unless the person who's conducting is somebody who's a historically informed performance specialist and will have filled the first half with other things, and it's a shame. Yeah.
Or Simon Rattle.
Simon Rattle, yeah. who occasionally will put 3 Haydn symphonies in a concert. Yeah. Exactly that. We're going to come to Simon later, because I know you've known him for many, many, many years, and collaborations and whatever else. So in 1979, you recorded Common Tones in Simple Time with the San Francisco Conservatory of Music Orchestra. How did your conducting career go on from there and out into the world professionally? What were your first steps into the professional world of conducting?
Well, I conducted in college, and then my first job, my first job was working in a shipyard, but my first teaching job was at a very small conservatory in San Francisco. And I, right from the start, was conducting new music concerts, everything from Cage and Stockhausen to pieces by, composers I knew. But I also conducted the orchestra. So I remember doing Brahms violin concerto and Petrushka and Prelude and Liebestod from Tristan. So I was already expanding. I didn't want to feel that I was what they call a contemporary music specialist.
Yeah.
Really, the first real professional, I guess you could call it, conducting I did was when Deborah Borda, a remarkable woman who is now currently the executive director of the New York Philharmonic, and I've known for over 40 years. She took over the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra and asked me if I would be one of several conductors on the theory that the smaller the orchestra, the more conductors you needed to have. So
I like that theory.
So one of the other conductors who was, a co-conductor with me was Christopher Hogwitz.
Oh.
I had wonderful time with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. This is back in the late 80s. And then, then I started conducting the Cleveland Orchestra, and my first British appearance, I think, was with the London Sinfonietta, and eventually everything kind of came to the point where I spend more time at home, and I have to decline most invitations, because as much as I'd love to do these trips like I'm on right now, bottom line is, I'm a composer first and foremost.
And I've interviewed Sir James Macmillan, and he says sometimes he can successfully compose when he's on the road doing trips like you're doing. Other times he can't. That's dependent on the mood he's in. That's dependent on the hotel he's in, or the place you've rented. Sometimes he takes a little keyboard with him. Sometimes he doesn't. Can you write when you're on the road?
No,
you can't.
Not at all. However, what I can do is proofread.
Yeah.
So, but that's the only thing. I can't compose.
No. And is that because you're so used to being in your own space to compose back home? Yeah, I can understand that. Totally understand that. 1979, you become the new music advisor at the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. What did that role consist of? Were you running a separate series to their main series? How did you run it? What were you doing?
Well, at the time, the orchestra had recently hired a new music director. Seiji Ozawa had gone on to Boston, and they hired a young Dutch conductor, Edo de Waart, and he said publicly that he wished that he could, meet someone to help him program contemporary music, because he didn't, was not entirely informed about it, which is just wonderful. How sincere and humble that was, that, most music directors would never let on the fact that they didn't know something. But anyway, I was introduced to him, and we got along immediately. And I can't remember which one of us proposed the idea of a special concert series. And they were wild concerts. They weren't done in the hall. They were done in crazy locations around San Francisco. I would put together, a program that might have the Berg Chamber Concerto followed by some insane, improvising saxophone quartet, or Robert Ashley, followed by the Schoenberg Ensemble, or Elliott Carter, followed by, Gavin Bryars. So they were really marvelously provocative, mixed bag. That went on for, I can't remember, 3 or 4 years until Edo left.
And did you share the conducting, or did Edo de Waart do it all?
No, he only conducted one piece in the whole time. He did the Berg Chamber Concerto, but I did most of the conducting. Yeah. Sometimes if it was a composer we invited who happened to be a conductor, they would do their own work. But I did most of it.
Well, it's funny. The minute you mentioned Edo de Waart's name, a massive ding went off in my head, because it was exactly the recording that he made of, I believe, Chairman Dance's the 2 fanfares, Short Ride and Trombolantana, with the San Francisco. It was the first time I heard your music, which blew my mind. But it was the minute I heard Edo de Waart's name, I thought, oh yes, well, of course, it was that record. That to me was the moment I thought, who is this guy? I want to hear more. And actually, very soon after that, in my county youth orchestra, we played the Chairman Dances, and that was it. I was completely sold. Recordings like that were just wonderful. And I joined the CBSO not so long afterwards, and we were recording Harmonielehre and all sorts of other things. I'm going to talk just briefly about an interview I watched this morning with you and Sarah Willis on the Berlin Philharmonic Concert Hall. I'm going to come back to the Berlin Phil later, but she was asking you about beating and about the fact that she thought they had
about my downbeat.
Exactly, yeah. But she wanted to know your feelings about playing on the beat as opposed to the sort of European tradition of playing after it. I mean, do you encounter that a lot when you cross the pond?
No, it was just that the very first piece that I did with the Berlin Philharmonic was Harmonielehre.
Yeah.
And you can't do an elegant,
No.
European style downbeat for that. You have to just,
yeah.
So I think it was a joke about that, really. If I do, like I start the Beethoven fourth, obviously I don't do that kind of beat. I do a much, more fluid type of motion.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're right. At the start of that piece, you need something rather forceful, rather violent, and very sure of the tempo to make sure that the orchestra comes in and plays that way. As I mentioned earlier on, I've spoken to other conductor composers or composer conductors, and I think there is a distinction between the two. When you're invited to an orchestra, more often than not, I'm guessing they'll ask you to conduct one of your own works. Do you have a plan about what you put with your music? For instance, James Macmillan loves putting other English pieces or other British pieces in with his music. But I mean, do you have a plan, or do you go more with the subject matter, or what? What's your ideas when somebody rings you up and says, "Will you come?" And you go, "Yeah, actually, I'd love to come, and I want to do this."
Well, I think usually, I'm going to be very, honest about it. Usually, I'm invited because orchestras want me to do a piece. They don't invite me to come and do Mahler. And sometimes, orchestras are very, very open. Most orchestras are. So, for example, the concerts that I just did in Lahti, Finland, I opened with La Valse, which is a piece I absolutely love, and really remarkable, complex piece of music. And I followed it with a double piano concerto by Philip Glass, which, I blow hot and cool about Philip's orchestra music, but this is a entertaining and accessible work. And then I finished with Harmonielehre because it had never been done by that orchestra. That's sort of my Firebird. Everybody wants to have me do that. But it depends. I conducted in Vienna a few years back, and the piece of mine I wanted to do was Absolute Jest, which is a work for string quartet and orchestra that uses fragments from late Beethoven scherzos. And so the orchestra there asked me to do a Beethoven symphony.
Great.
Well, that would go well with Absolute Jest. And I thought, my God, you want me to do a Beethoven symphony? Well, I did. I did the fourth. And it was wonderful. It was just a terrific experience. Obviously, they knew it. And what else was on that program? I did the Stravinsky Symphony in 3 movements. So there was kind of nice, powerful energy.
That's a great program.
Sometimes I do a whole program of my own music. That can be dangerous in some cities if I'm not well known. I remember like 25 years ago, Charles Dutoit invited me to Montreal. And, he said, "I want all John Adams." And I said, "Are you sure? I'm not that well known in Montreal." No, it must be all your music. And, there were not a lot of people in the hall. But, there are some cities where I can do that, like Amsterdam and London and Paris. I could probably get away with it in New York and Los Angeles, but it's still a hard sell these days in the orchestra world, because basically people who buy tickets to orchestras are like people who go to big museums. They're basically want to go and hear something they're familiar with.
That's true. Though, I always look at it using that metaphor as they go to see the things they're familiar with. I can count many times I've been to the Belvedere Palace in Vienna to see the Klimts. I go to see the Klimts, but every time I see something new every time I go, and it actually makes the visit more interesting. Of course I've seen the Klimts. They're beautiful. That's why I go. But to see a new Egon Schiele or to see a new painting by something else is equally important.
I have a funny story. Alan Gilbert toured with the New York Philharmonic, and they did an entire program of my music. This is during my 70th birthday year. And I couldn't go to all the programs. I missed the one at Barbican, but they played in the new hall in Hamburg. And it was an all Adams program. And I was able to go to that, and the hall was completely full, and I was just on the moon. And the next morning, I'm being driven in the taxi to the airport, and I mentioned that I'd been to the new hall, and he said, "Ja, das ist ausverkauft." He says, every concert sold out because everybody wants to see the hall.
How to be brought down to earth from the moon.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. When you go, or maybe you don't go, to watch other conductors conducting your music, is it easy to let go? Once the child has been born and then other people obviously want to conduct your music, is it easy to sit in the audience and let go? Or do you not find you've got the time to go and watch other people conduct your music?
It's difficult. Obviously, I get a great deal of invitations to come and what we say, grip and grin, go up on stage and shake hands. And unless it's something very, very special, or obviously a premiere, I just have to say no. But, it's funny because, I keep a journal and I have a memory of some other conductor doing a piece of mine, and it's such a wonderful memory. And then I go back and look at the journal and see how angry I was at the Tempe or something. So things all, they do come out in the wash eventually. I have certain conductors who just absolutely understand immediately. And I just am so grateful to those conductors, and I think they know it because they love the music and they keep on programming it. And then there are other conductors who let's say generally don't do a new piece, but they think maybe they'll do a piece of mine. And I can think of one conductor he's a really terrific conductor and a lovely person. The only piece of mine he's done once was Harmony Lyra, and he told me he'd never been so terrified in his life doing it. So I don't expect him to do much more of my music, but I was grateful that he at least was willing to try to do it.
And we mentioned Simon Rattle earlier on. I was lucky enough both to record an album of your music, but also you wrote Lollapalooza for us, which was for Simon's 40th birthday, I think, which dates how old we all are now. An incredible piece of music, which I absolutely love and desperately want to program sometime soon. When you, little bit like working with a soloist, let's say Leila Josefovich, when you get to know a conductor, do you think you can write music specifically for them, knowing what their attributes are? Like for Alan Gilbert or for Simon or...
Well, I wish I could say that was the case, but it's not. I mean, I just am writing the piece I want. Michael Tilson Thomas, who's done a great deal of my music, and we're very close friends, but he several times, said, well, my gift as a conductor is to push and pull and do all these things with the phrasing, and with your music, I just have to keep things from falling apart. I think he was expressing, a certain, frustration that what he was best at wasn't being called upon in the music. But I think he's exaggerating, because he's done wonderful things with it.
Well, you've led on to one more little question. Well, it's not a little question at all. It's a very personal question from me. William Walton was quoted as saying that he never understood what the difficulty was conducting his overture Portsmouth Point. Probably because he wrote it. He didn't find it difficult to conduct at all, whereas most conductors do find it difficult. For various reasons, I've conducted Short Ride in the Fast Machine, your piece, 31 times, and I've desperately tried to memorize it. And blow me, I
why do you want to do that?
I cannot memorize it for the life of me. I always fall over. When you write a piece of music, do you ever look down at the time signatures or multi-time signatures you've written and think, "Oh shit! One of these days I'm might have to conduct this myself, and it's very difficult"? Or do you not think that at all? You're just writing from the heart, and what comes out is what comes out?
No, I think actually the opposite's the case. That sometimes I worry that I'm always writing something that falls within my toolkit. And I think of somebody like Ligeti, who obviously wasn't a conductor, and he just wrote what came into his mind and let somebody else deal with the realities. But with that said, it's wonderful to look at Mahler's scores and study them from the point of view of him being a conductor.
Yes, that's very true.
And seeing all the things, one of the things about Mahler is that he was always frustrated with the woodwinds, that they weren't loud enough. And so, for example, if you look at the opening to the last movement of the Seventh Symphony, this is insanely difficult, super hyperactive writing for the woodwinds, and everyone is playing. He doesn't give somebody a little break to hop in. I once read in a biography of Mahler this really funny story of, I think they were rehearsing in the pit, Valka or something, and the woodwinds weren't loud enough, and he said, louder, 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 and they kept playing, and then he said, hold your instruments up, hold them up, blow harder, and they did, and it wasn't loud enough, and then he said, stand up. You can see in the orchestration of certain composers who were very gifted conductors, how they experienced the orchestra. But with that said, one of the most absolutely astonishing orchestrators is, of course, Ravel, and apparently he was a terrible conductor, and so was Debussy.
Right.
But they didn't let that get in the way of their work.
Before we go to the 10 questions, a question that every conductor has been asked: when you come to learn a new score, do you sit at your desk and learn it using your inner ear, or do you use a piano? And are you a scribbler in your scores in red, blue, and black of notes and cues, and or do you just leave it all blank and to the rehearsal?
Well, no, I think I'm always suspicious of the people saying that they just look at the score and hear it in their head. I think that's really very doubtful. People imagine that we composers walk around with an internal iPod in our
Yes.
head, and we can just dial up some piece and hear it in great detail. And of course, we don't hear that way. I can look at a score, especially if I know the piece. I can look at a score, and I wouldn't say so much hear it, but I can feel it. So if I'm trying to learn a piece, I basically try to learn a piece as if I could do it from memory.
Yeah.
I want to learn it that well. But I also listen to recordings.
Yeah.
I listen to recordings because I think that's part of the culture of, the history. I mentioned that I did La Valse last week, and it was a great education, because you can do this on YouTube now, is to go back and hear a recording from the Orchestre Lamoureux from 1930.
Wow.
Or hear what, various Charles Munch did with it, and on and on and on and on. And of course, with each conductor, you probably hear things that you disagree with, but you also have little moments of illumination. Oh, I never noticed that. Or, oh, that's a wonderful way of treating that. It's a very rich delving into a piece. One of my goals in life has been to have done all the Sibelius symphonies, and I've done almost all of them. I don't understand the Third Symphony. I don't think I'll ever do that.
It's funny. I don't understand the Fourth Symphony.
Yeah. So I love the Fourth. I've done the Fourth.
Well, maybe we ought to have a chat about each other's ones we don't understand.
Yeah. But I'm doing the First Symphony with several really good orchestras this year, and it also informs my composing as well. And I often wonder what it's like to not be a composer and to learn a score. I mean, how is that different from the way I experience learning a score? Because I'm always thinking about, that's an interesting compositional decision. Why did he do that, or et cetera, et cetera. And I think probably if you're not a composer, you may miss a lot of detail.
Well, I think all you do is add one question in between, which is, that's an interesting piece of orchestration. But then your next question should be, and I wonder what led him to compose it that way. But I think sometimes conductors might stop before going on to that one you've just said about, why compose it that way? What was the decision? But it's fascinating to hear that you use recordings. A lot of the people who've come on the podcast do. Pavel Yevis famously said, "You've been an idiot not to go back and listen to the greatest conductors in the world conducting repertoire you're about to conduct. Why would you not want to do that?" Yeah, absolutely. If you are new to this podcast, you may not know that there is another way you can learn about conductors and conducting by subscribing to my Patreon page. You can hear interviews with musicians, composers, soloists and managers and hear their thoughts on conducting and conductors. You can read my diaries when I guest conduct. You can take part in group meetings with other like-minded fans of this podcast. You can read articles on conducting and conductors and also see videos of the great conductors, and you can even have conducting lessons from myself. All of this is available at patreon.com/a mic on the podium. And from just £5 a month, which is about the price of a nice glass of wine, you can gain access to this ever-growing resource on conductors and conducting. Details and links to the page are in the show notes attached to this episode. Now, the all-important 10 questions with my guest, John Adams. John, it's that moment of every podcast episode where you get to answer the 10 questions. And I always start with the same two. What sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
What sound or noise do I love? I'm always terrible with these, exceptionalist questions. Because there's so many sounds I love. Can I pass on that? I really, what can I say?
Well, at least you've got many that you love. I suspect, therefore,
I think the sound that I hate the most is Donald Trump's voice.
You're not alone in giving that answer on this podcast.
Yeah.
You won't be surprised to learn that, I'm sure. You are not the first person to say that. Though one conductor did rather euphemistically you just say the sound she hated was American politics, but we all knew what she meant.
Sure. Yeah.
Question 3. If you had 24 hours free, what would you like to spend it doing?
Oh, good. That's nice that you started with if.
Of course.
Well, I think I share with certain composers a love for hiking and trekking. I have 2 locations in the California countryside. One is high up in the Sierra Mountains, a small cabin, and then another little, what I call my Mahler composing hut, which is in the deep coastal forests. So I love being in settings like that and walking.
And I'm assuming that's a wonderful place, as you've alluded to with Mahler and whatever, for you to both empty your thoughts, but also to have lots of thoughts about music and themes and ideas.
Yes, it would be a lot better if I didn't have internet, but these days, there's always some reason that you have to have it.
That's true. Question number 4. Can you name your favorite conductor or conductors of yesteryear?
Oh, well, I can't name my favorite conductor of living conductors because I would offend somebody if I left them out. Of conductors who are no longer with us, I'm very fond of Claudio Abbado. I have a recording that he made of Falstaff with the Berlin Philharmonic that is it's just a miracle, the whole thing. I have an extremely violent love-hate relationship with Leonard Bernstein. There are many things that he did that I find just vulgar. But then there are things that he could do that were just incomparably wonderful. And that's probably good. I think I'd like people to think that about me rather than just, he's good. I have conductors whose reputations always puzzle me. For example, Toscanini, when I'm studying a piece of standard repertoire, if I listen to let's say 10 or 20 different performances, it's always the Toscanini that appalls me. So I don't understand what the magic was there. Maybe it was just something that didn't transfer to, electronic technology. Well, that's enough, I think.
There are, those names are, great names of the conducting world. It sounds like in your preamble to that answer, you're going to refuse to answer question 5 then, which is who would be a favorite current conductor? And I know it's a cruel question. And sometimes people have been repertoire specific, but I have had occasionally people who said they'd rather not answer for various reasons. So if you'd rather not answer because you don't want to offend anyone,
look, I can say that I have many wonderful conductors who've done my music. And many of them are, very close friends.
Yes.
So if I made a list and I left somebody out, I'd feel devastated. But I can mention that, there are people I've known for a long time, like Simon. I've had a wonderful, wonderful creative friendship with Gustavo Dudamel, who's done not only a lot of my music, but he's done an astonishing amount of contemporary music for which he never gets much credit for because people associate him with other things. And as I mentioned, I go way back with Michael Tilson Thomas, who the first time he ever did a piece of mine was 1983. Of course, Edo de Waart was very instrumental in doing my music. Alan Gilbert has been a big fan. I'm sure I'm forgetting, really David Robertson loves my work and I can always count on David to do a really marvelous performance. So that's not too shabby. Marin Alsop, she's done terrific things, and I recently wrote and dedicated a piece to her. And then there's some younger conductors that I'm very excited about. Karina Kanalakis. It was not too long ago that she was a fellow in a conducting workshop that David Robertson and I did at Carnegie Hall, and now she's well on her way to being a superstar. And this young Korean conductor who is going to do my next opera, Unsung Kim, I've only seen her conduct once, and she did, pretty standard repertoire Tosca, but I was really impressed with the fluid quality of her conducting and her absolute confidence and vitality that she communicated to the orchestra. So, yeah.
Brilliant choices.
Conductors, yeah.
Well, brilliant choices, and I'll put a disclaimer on this podcast that if you're one of those names John's forgotten, he's smiling and grinning at me and nodding and saying, yes, I'm really sorry. So there we are. There's a disclaimer. And, as it happens, John had forgotten somebody really important and sent me this small little soundbite after the interview had finished.
And, of course, Esa-Pekka Salonen, for whom I wrote in 1999 my big symphony, Naive and Sentimental Music, and who's been not only a wonderful conductor of my music, but also a composer colleague.
What is the hardest work you've ever conducted?
Well, hard comes in all sorts of different forms. I mean, I remember touring with a youth orchestra in Europe about 10 years ago and doing the Sibelius Seventh. And these kids didn't understand it. And I worked so hard. But, I wondered, well, is this my problem? Or is it theirs? Or is it just, this is a hard nut to crack? But I remember every time, but that piece is not even 20 minutes long, and I would come off stage and have to change my shirt. I would be so, exhausted from doing it. Just in terms of pure technical video game concentration, Steve Reich's Tehillim is really really tricky because it goes very fast and the meters are changing constantly. And you can ask any conductor who's done that piece and their eyebrows go up because we all know how hard it is. Let's see, I've done some Conlon Nancarrow. They were arrangements of his player piano music, which I did with the Ensemble Moderne years ago, and those were very tricky. I think the Ives Fourth was the tricky thing about the Ives Fourth. It wasn't so much beating time; it was trying to figure out how to put it all together, because so much of the rhythmic stuff in it is it's almost irrational. And I actually did take some of the more complex meters and I put them into a program that I have, and sort of I wouldn't say round them off, but I made them within, let's say, a hemi-demi semi-quaver, made them possible to play without approximating, which is what otherwise you have to do with the Fourth Symphony.
That's a tough piece. Yeah, it's tough because, as you said, the incredibly complex rhythms, incredibly complex orchestration. You've got violinists that start off stage, then come on stage and go off stage again. But the one that made me smile is Sibelius 7. For a non-conductor, that piece just sounds like the most organic thing you'll ever listen to. As you said, 20 minutes. You're constantly playing in your mind of how much a cello rondo, where you've got to get to in 100 bars time. Because if you get that wrong, then the next section is at the wrong tempo, and you're doing that all of the time. And I was grinning away and thinking, well, that's a perfect choice. It's so hard. And if you've got an orchestra there who's not with you, or B with you, really into the piece, it's so difficult. Oh, a brilliant choice. When traveling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
Here it is right here. This is it's called Fingertip Moistener. It's like a little grease. Yeah. And I always have it on the podium with me because I just often can't turn a page without grabbing two by mistake. Maybe it's because, over the years, my fingers have lost some of their, ability to, pick up a piece of paper. So I desperately need this. And, when a music librarian for an orchestra like the Berlin Phil comes and says, "Maestro, may I take your scores?" And I always hand them this thumb grease and they look at it like, what is this? And that's what I absolutely need. Well,
it's a first. I've never heard of thumb grease. And it's the first time I've heard that answer. But what a brilliant thing. I'm going to investigate it.
Well, if you've ever been, conducting something that it's going a mile a minute and there's a page turn every 3 seconds and the conductor turns 2 pages by mistake, you'll understand why it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my fingers are normally a bit sweaty, so I can normally do a page turn, but yeah, I'm going to investigate that. Brilliant answer. I totally didn't expect that. That's wonderful. What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
Well, this is more political and economic and not terribly witty of me to say, but I'm very distressed by how little rehearsal time there is, particularly in the United States. I just came from Finland where I had 3 days of rehearsing from 10 to 2. Yeah. And then the 4th day was 11 to 2. And we were really able to get things done. But in the United States, there is this terrible pressure to get a program done in as little time as possible. And, one orchestra, I couldn't believe it, has actually, in a 2.5-hour service, their break is 25 minutes long because they feel they're the best orchestra in the world. So they don't need that extra 5 minutes. So that's a really a terrible thing. That doesn't really have to do with conducting. It really has to do with the culture of orchestras.
But I disagree in the fact, I'm from the UK and a lot of my work's in the UK, and the amount of rehearsal time that we have here is far less than it is on continental Europe. I've just returned from Trondheim in Norway and done a film music concert there. The sort of thing that in the UK, one orchestra in particular, I know would attempt to do it on 1 3-hour rehearsal, the dress rehearsal, and then do the concert. In Norway, I had, much like you, I had from 10 till 2:30 for 2 days, then a full 3-hour dress rehearsal in the morning before the concert in the evening on the 3rd day. It meant that we were under no stress. Players weren't smashing trumpets into their face or, killing themselves with vibrato or whatever, and then they're tied in the concert. It meant that you could just do it at a luxurious pace and nobody feels stressed about it. Yeah.
Another thing I believe that a conductor should live in the community that he's music director in, or she.
Yes.
And I have 2 instances, both in where I live, where the conductors do live there. Gustavo lives in Los Angeles, And MTT, his home was in San Francisco. So they became more than just the music director. They became really cultural figureheads in the community. I mean, what Gustavo has done there with the Hispanic culture and with youth orchestras has just absolutely revitalized music in the Los Angeles area. And Michael was, he was like as more popular than the mayor in San Francisco. And the trouble is, you get a lot of big orchestras and they have a music director who might keep an apartment, but they're really not part of the community. They're flying off, or they've got another orchestra or an opera company, and it's just like a gig for them. So I deeply appreciate a music director becoming part of the community.
Here. I've said it before on the podcast, and I'm hearing it again. Absolutely true. Couldn't agree with you more. Number 9. Now, you're yet another one who's already got 2 jobs, composer and conductor, like Sir James Macmillan, and also like Daniel Harding, airline pilot and conductor. So if you could choose another profession other than your own 2 that you already do, what would you have liked to have done, or would you like to attempt?
Well, I love to write, and I probably would maybe have written fiction. It's just something I grew up with. I've always had an ability to express myself in words. Or I might like to teach very young children. It's interesting. I don't teach, but I'm always open to young composers bringing their works to me. But it's always interesting that the younger they are, the more interesting the experience is. And the older they get, the more fraught with anxieties and neuroses, and the less I can do for them. So, it's just wonderful. I remember this very talented young boy coming over to my house. I think he was like, his voice hadn't even changed. He was probably 8 years old or something. And I said, "Have you ever heard the Mahler Fourth?" And he said, "No." And just to be able to sit with him and, be there at that moment when this obviously very, very sensitive and talented and bright kid was having his first encounter with the Mahler Fourth was just, it was just a privilege for me.
If the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Well, I have to confess to my California fidelity that obviously a good Napa Valley Cabernet.
Of course.
And, some of our fresh produce, maybe something that my wife has grown in her own garden, because when summer rolls around in Northern California, I never go to Tanglewood or Aspen or Lucerne because I just want to stay home and enjoy the good life in Northern California.
Well, that sounds very good. I mean, it's not as if you're short of good produce, and the wine is fantastic. And John, it's been fantastic. And as I said at the beginning, an honor, as somebody who's played your music a lot and has conducted, as I said, Short Ride over 30 times and want to conduct lots more, especially Lollapalooza. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for coming on and doing the podcast for me.
Oh, well, I had a wonderful time talking with you too, Michael.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat with an Irish conductor who divides her time between composing and conducting, both on the concert platform and in the recording studio. She works often in the world of film, TV and video games, and in 2020 she was the first woman to conduct at the Oscars. But until then, bye-bye.